The auditorium lights glowed with a soft amber hue, casting long shadows across the rows of polished seats. The air buzzed with that quiet hum of expectation, the kind you feel before something unusual happens, even if no one can quite put their finger on it. At the center of the stage, Joel Osteen stood in his familiar posture, smile, warm gestures flowing, his voice lifting the audience in waves. His words rolled smoothly, like a carefully practiced melody, each phrase meant to inspire, to uplift, to reassure. But in the crowd toward the middle rows sat John Kennedy. Arms, folded expression, steady eyes, focused not with admiration, but with an intent that carried weight. His presence alone felt different. He wasn't blending in with the energy of the audience. He wasn't swaying with the rhythm of Joel's words. He was still almost too still, like a stone dropped into water, creating a ripple you couldn't see, but somehow sensed. It began subtly. Kennedy leaned slightly forward, his gaze sharpening as Joel continued to speak. A few people near him shifted in their seats, noticing his quiet defiance. He wasn't disruptive, not yet, but he wasn't passive either. It was as if he had come not to listen, but to confront, though no one knew what form that confrontation might take. Then it happened. Kennedy rose to his feet, the sound of his chair scraping against the polished floor cut through the room. For a moment, Joel's cadence faltered just slightly, barely noticeable to most, but enough to mark the shift. Heads turned. Whispers fluttered like nervous wings through the crowd. Kennedy's voice carried steady, not loud, not aggressive, just firm. He spoke in a tone that demanded to be heard, even though he said only a handful of words. Those words, though, carried the weight of a challenge. And in that instant, the room's energy changed. Joel Osteen's expression stiffened. His eyes darted briefly toward the edge of the stage where members of his security team stood in quiet readiness. A subtle nod, barely visible, passed between them. The message was clear: remove the disruption before it escalates. The guards began to move, weaving discreetly through the aisles, their black suits blending with the dimness of the auditorium. The audience sensed the shift, their murmurs swelling into a low wave of confusion and anticipation. People weren't sure what they were witnessing. Was this man dangerous? Was he simply outspoken? Or was something deeper unfolding right before their eyes? As Kennedy stood his ground, unmoving, the tension thickened. Joel continued to speak, trying to pull back control of the atmosphere, his tone rising, his gestures widening, as if his energy alone could wash over the disruption. But everyone could feel it now. The unspoken battle between authority and dissent, between the carefully curated harmony of the stage and the raw, unfiltered conviction of one man refusing to sit down. The security guards closed in their hands, brushing discreetly against their radios, their steps heavy but quiet. Joel's voice grew firmer, the charm still present, but edged now with something sharper. And that's when the moment crystallized, the collision between the image of polished calm and the reality of confrontation. Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply looked straight ahead, eyes fixed on the stage as if daring the room to ask itself a question. What happens when someone refuses to be silenced? That question lingered in the air, unspoken but powerful. As the scene froze in tension, the audience waited. The guards closed in and Joel Osteen prepared to enforce his will on the moment. But what Kennedy did next, no one in that auditorium would forget. The auditorium may have been the setting, but the real stage was built years before this night. To understand the tension between Joel Osteen and John Kennedy, you have to see them, not just as two men, but as two worlds colliding. Joel Osteen is a figure people think they know, the gleaming smile, the polished sermons broadcast across television networks, the stadium-sized churches filled with music and light. He's built an empire on positivity, on the idea that faith should feel like a sunrise, warm and welcoming to millions. He's a symbol of inspiration. To others, he represents something else entirely. A carefully packaged, commercialized version of faith stripped of struggle, polished for profit. And that's the paradox of Osteen. His message of hope resonates because it feels simple, clean, and easy to grasp. But real life, is rarely simple, clean, or easy. The cracks in that polished image have drawn criticism over the years. Questions about wealth, about exclusivity, about whether the faith he presents is more performance than practice. John Kennedy, on the other hand, couldn't be more different. He wasn't standing in that auditorium to enjoy the service or to be inspired. Kennedy carried himself with the weight of someone who had seen enough of the world to know that inspiration without accountability can be dangerous. He was direct, unpolished, and deeply unwilling to compromise when he felt truth was on the line. He didn't have the cameras, the stage lights, or the thousands of adoring followers. What he had instead was conviction, the kind that doesn't fade when people look away. For Kennedy, faith wasn't about polished appearances or sound bites clipped neatly for Sunday broadcasts. It was about honesty, raw, difficult honesty. And if that honesty made people uncomfortable, so be it. These two men were bound to clash, because their philosophies of faith were almost opposites. Joel Osteen believed in maintaining harmony, smoothing over conflict with uplifting phrases, and keeping his audience in a constant state of optimism. His greatest strength, his ability to inspire, was also his greatest shield. If he could keep the crowd happy, there would be no room for questions that cut too deep. Kennedy believed the opposite. To him, truth demanded confrontation. Silence in the face of what you believed was wrong was complicity. And in his mind that night in that auditorium, there was something wrong that needed to be confronted. But let's be clear, this wasn't just a battle between two men. It was a clash of perspectives, a larger conversation about what faith should be, about who gets to decide the boundaries of dialogue, and about whether dissent has a place inside institutions that thrive on control. Think about the stakes for each side. For Osteen, order was everything. His reputation depended on presenting a seamless experience where people left feeling good. Disruption threatened that image, and with it, the trust of his audience. If Kennedy's defiance spread, if it inspired others to stand up, Osteen risked losing more than a moment. The risk losing the control that kept his world intact. For Kennedy, the stakes were different. This wasn't about reputation or image, it was about conscience. He could have stayed silent, blended in, gone home, unnoticed, but that wasn't why he came. For him, silence would have been betrayal, not to Osteen, not to the audience, but to his own principles. By standing up, he put himself at risk of being silenced, humiliated, or even physically removed. Yet that risk was worth it to prove a point, that truth deserves a voice, even when it's inconvenient. It's important to pause here and really picture these two men, Joel Osteen on stage. Posture open, his words floating like polished glass, reflecting light, but never revealing depth. He thrived on anticipation, on knowing exactly when to smile, when to pause, when to let his voice rise into a swell that made the audience clap without even realizing it. John Kennedy in the crowd, quiet at first, deliberate, watching closely. Not swayed by the cadence of Joel's delivery, not charmed by the glow of the stage. He wasn't an audience member. He was a counterweight, and in the silence of his folded arms and steady gaze, there was already resistance. The people in the auditorium that night didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness more than a disruption. They were about to see a teststone that would reveal not only who these men were, but what they stood for when faced with opposition. Because here's the truth, authority and dissent have always had a fragile relationship. History is full of moments where one person's refusal to sit down, to be quiet, to go along, change the entire conversation. Sometimes it ends in silence, sometimes it ends in revelation. For Joel Osteen, the night represented a test of control. Could he keep the atmosphere intact, keep the narrative in his hands? Or would Kennedy's presence puncture the image he had built so carefully? For Kennedy, it was a test of courage. Could he hold his ground when the weight of the room pressed against him? Could he endure the consequences of standing up, when the easy choice was to sit back down? That's why this wasn't just about one man being told to leave. It was about what happens when two visions of faith, one polished, one raw, collide in a space where only one is supposed to exist. And as the security guards edged closer as the audience whispered, and Joel Osteen tightened his grip on the microphone, the two perspectives drew closer to impact. One spoke in practiced rhythms designed to smooth over tension, the other stood silent, unyielding, carrying the kind of weight that no microphone could soften. In that moment, both men were more than themselves. Osteen became the embodiment of institutional control, the desire to protect order at any cost. Kennedy became the embodiment of resistance, the belief that some truths cannot be hushed, even when every force in the room pushes against them. The clash wasn't loud, yet, but it was coming, and everyone in that room could feel it. The auditorium was alive with its usual rhythm. Soft laughter, scattered applause, the sound of people shifting in their seats. Joel Osteen had been pacing the stage with the assurance of someone who knew exactly how to command attention. His words flowed like music rising and falling in carefully measured tones. He didn't just speak, he orchestrated. But not everyone was swept into the tide of his cadence. From the fourth row, John Kennedy sat stiffly, his shoulders squared, eyes locked on Osteen. The subtle bobbing heads around him, the murmured amens, the gentle swaying to the music, none of it reached him. He wasn't there to be lifted up. He was there to look deeper, past the shine into what he saw as a carefully constructed performance. And then in one quiet moment, when Joel paused to sip from a glass of water, Kennedy stood. It wasn't dramatic at first. No shouting, no raised hands, just the scrape of a chair against the polished floor, and the weight of silence as one man broke the unspoken contract of the audience to sit, listen, and applaud at the right times. Heads turned. The pause in Osteen's voice stretched longer than usual. "What about truth?" Kennedy's words cut through the room. Not loud, but steady. The air seemed to shift. People glanced at each other, unsure if they'd heard correctly. Osteen blinked his smile, holding but his eyes narrowing just slightly, like a pianist hitting a new, unexpected note, and trying to fold it back into the melody. "Sir," Osteen said smoothly. Microphone angled toward his lips, "We're here tonight to celebrate God's goodness, to lift each other up. Let's stay focused on that." His tone was warm. Practice meant to redirect without confrontation, but Kennedy didn't sit. His voice carried again, stronger this time. "God's goodness isn't a show, Joel. It isn't lights and cameras. It isn't about how you look on television." The room tightened. You could feel the discomfort ripple through the crowd like a sudden draft. Some people whispered, others shifted uneasily, glancing toward the ushers, already inching forward. Osteen's smile faltered, just a fraction. "Friend," he said, stretching the word like an olive branch, "we all have different ways of expressing our faith. Tonight, I just want to remind everyone that this is a place of peace." His voice was soft, placating, but Kennedy shook his head. "Peace without truth is just silence, and silence isn't faith. It's fear." That line landed heavy, and for the first time, Osteen didn't have an immediate response. The kind of polished reply he was known for seemed just out of reach. He took a step back, his fingers tightening around the microphone, his smile freezing in place. The ushers reached Kennedy's row, leaning in to speak softly, gesturing toward the aisle. But Kennedy didn't move. His voice rose, not in anger, but in clarity. "Why are you afraid of questions? Joel, why can't you let someone speak?" The tension was no longer under the surface. It was on stage in the air, in the hearts of every person watching. Some in the audience clapped softly, almost nervously, as if affirming Kennedy's courage, while unsure if it was safe to do so. Others hissed, whispering for him to sit down, muttering about disruption. Osteen raised a hand, signaling the ushers to pause. His voice, when it came again, was lower, steadier, but with an edge beneath the smoothness. "Sir, I respect your passion, but this is not the time or the place. Please, let's continue with tonight's message." Kennedy held his ground. "That's the problem," he said. His voice cracked just slightly, not from a ningjir, but from memory. "Faith isn't pretending the hurt isn't real. Faith is carrying the hurt and still showing up. Faith is admitting loss and knowing God hasn't turned away. Faith isn't about avoiding pain, it's about not being alone in it." And then, almost like a confession, he added, "My wife died in a hospital bed while your words played on TV. And do you know what? Your version of faith told me that maybe I hadn't believed hard enough. That maybe her death was my failure. That's not faith. That's shame dressed up as hope." Gasps rippled through the audience, not because the story was sensational, but because it was raw. It was what so many had felt, but never said aloud. Osteen's eyes flickered, surprise, discomfort, maybe even guilt, but he didn't interrupt. This was the climax. Kennedy wasn't a protester anymore. He wasn't even an interruption. He was a mirror, and the image he held up was one too powerful to ignore. The face of grief, the voice of truth standing uninvited but unshakable in a space built on control. The ushers shifted nervously. They could have forced him out at any moment, but even they seemed reluctant now, as though removing him would mean admitting that his words had struck too deep. Kennedy turned slightly, scanning the audience, not as a performer, but as a man searching for connection. "Tell me," he said softly, "how many of you have prayed for something and didn't get it? Hands didn't rise, but faces did." A mother in the third row bit her lip, remembering a father in the back. Clenched his fists, a young man lowered his head, blinking back tears. Kennedy nodded. That's what I'm talking about. Faith is not a guarantee of outcome. It's not a promise of prosperity. It's the strength to hold on when the outcome breaks you. That's where God lives, not just in the blessing, but in the breaking. The room was hushed. Even Osteen didn't move. And then Kennedy said the line that became the echo of the night, the question no one could shake. Do you want followers who are happy, or followers who are honest? It wasn't just aimed at Osteen, it was aimed at everyone in the room, everyone watching online, everyone who had ever traded truth for comfort. The question was brutal in its simplicity, and it was one Osteen could not answer without unraveling the very stage he stood on. Because if he said honest, it meant admitting that the message he preached was incomplete. If he said happy, it meant confessing that truth was secondary. So, Osteen said nothing, and in that silence, Kennedy's words carried more weight than any sermon could. The climax wasn't about who won the debate. It wasn't even about the confrontation itself. It was about the collision of two visions of faith, one that smoothed over pain and one that acknowledged it. That night, truth stood against comfort, and for the first time in that church, comfort blinked. The silence stretched. Not the awkward kind, not even the hostile kind. This was a silence filled with weight, as though the very walls of the auditorium were holding their breath. Osteen stood motionless, his practiced signal frozen in place, caught between response and retreat. For once his words, the endless flow of positivity and reassurance, weren't enough. Kennedy lowered his eyes, not in defeat, but in release. He said what needed to be said. Whether anyone agreed didn't matter anymore. He wasn't searching for approval. He was searching for truth, and in speaking it aloud, he seemed lighter. Slowly he stepped back, letting the stillness swallow him. The ushers who had been poised to escort him out exchanged uneasy glances, but none moved forward. No one dared to touch him now, because in that moment it was clear Kennedy hadn't come to disrupt. He had come to witness. The audience shifted, restless but deeply affected. Some leaned forward, others leaned back, but everyone seemed caught in the same fragile spell. The words Kennedy had spoken had pulled them inward, forcing each listener to revisit their own quiet disappointments, the unanswered prayers, the nights of doubt, the moments when faith felt like silence. It wasn't the polished sermon they had expected when they walked in. It wasn't what they had paid to hear, but in a strange way, it was something they needed. One woman in the front row dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A man in the balcony whispered a prayer under his breath. Though whether it was for Kennedy, for himself, or for Osteen, no one could tell. The tension in the room had shifted. It wasn't the tension of conflict anymore. It was the tension of reflection, and Joel Osteen, for all his training and experience, seemed unable to step back into control. He tried once, clearing his throat, lifting his microphone, but the usual cadence wouldn't come. The words felt too shallow in the shadow of what had just been spoken, so he paused. And that pause may have been the most honest thing he offered that night. Kennedy finally turned toward the doors, preparing to leave on his own terms. There was no triumph in his steps, no arrogance in his stride, just quiet dignity. And as he walked, a voice from the crowd broke the silence. Thank you. It was a whisper at first. Then another joined it, then another. Thank you, thank you. Not applause, not cheers, just gratitude, raw and trembling. Kennedy didn't turn around. He didn't bow or wave. He simply kept walking, as though the words were not meant for him alone, but for anyone who had ever spoken truth into a room that preferred comfort. Later, long after Kennedy had gone, the church lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed. Fragments of his words lingered. Some people defended Osteen, insisting that positivity was still a necessary balm in a world already heavy with pain. Others carried Kennedy's words home, replaying them in their minds, wondering what it meant to live honestly in faith. No one agreed completely, but no one left untouched, and maybe that was the point. Not that one man won and another lost. Not that a church was shaken or that a leader was exposed, but that for a single night, comfort and truth collided in the open, and everyone in the room was forced to decide which mattered more. Kennedy never claimed victory. He never gave a final lecture. He simply walked out, having said the one thing he came to say, that silence is not peace and that faith without truth is just performance. It was in its own way a kind of sermon. Weeks later, those who were there still remembered the line that cut deepest. They quoted it over coffee in small groups in quiet conversations where honesty could breathe. Do you want followers who are happy or followers who are honest? The question didn't fade. It haunted, but in the best way. It forced reflection without demanding answers. And in the hush of that unresolved moment, something shifted. Not a revolution, not a collapse, but a reminder, subtle, undeniable, that truth once spoken does not leave quietly. Kennedy had left behind no instructions, no calls to action, just presence, just testimony. And in that lingering echo, the audience found themselves holding a new thought. That perhaps the most powerful faith isn't the one that erases pain, but the one that sits with it. Sometimes the most honest prayer a woman later wrote in her journal after that night is simply this: "I'm still here." That was the reflection. That was the gift. Not certainty, not closure, but the courage to face life without filters. Long after the lights dimmed and the seats were empty, the question still hung in the air like smoke. What do we really want from those who lead us, comfort or truth? It wasn't about Joel Osteen anymore, or even John Kennedy. It was about something deeper, about the spaces we build, the voices we trust, the kind of faith or conviction we choose to live with. Because beneath the clash of personalities, beneath the tension of that night, lay something universal. The struggle between hearing what soothes us and facing what unsettles us. Both have their place. Comfort keeps us steady. Truth keeps us honest. But when the two collide, when one threatens to erase the other, we are left with a choice no leader can make for us. The echo of Kennedy's words lingers precisely because it was not polished, not rehearsed, not softened for applause. It was raw, imperfect, but unmistakably real. And maybe that's why it stayed, because at the end of the day, sermons fade. Leaders change, but one question always returns, quiet, insistent, unresolved. Do we dare to prefer honesty over ease? That's the thought he left behind. Not an answer, but a challenge. Not a command, but a mirror. And the truth is, what we see in that mirror is entirely up to us.